In the winter skies of 1942, high above the Solomon Islands, a teenage waste gunner found himself facing a problem that would haunt thousands of his fellow airmen. Eddie Kowalski, barely 19 years old, gripped his Browning M2 machine gun as it shuddered violently in his hands. Through the aircraft's fuselage, he spotted a Japanese Zero fighter emerging at his 10 o'clock position, roughly 300 yards distant, cutting across his view from left to right with the precision of a thrown blade. Every fiber of his being told him what to do: place the crosshairs on the enemy's fuselage and fire. He did exactly that. 50 rounds erupted from his weapon, tracer fire painting arcs through the thin air, and Eddie watched in disbelief as every single bullet passed behind the Zero's tail section. The Japanese pilot continued on his course, seemingly unaware he had even been targeted, while Eddie's ammunition counter spun downward. This scene repeated itself across every combat zone during the war's early years. American gunners, properly trained and equipped with exceptional weapons, were failing to hit their targets. The Army Air Forces launched an investigation in early 1943, analyzing gun camera recordings from bomber operations over both Europe and the Pacific. What they discovered was alarming. Trained aerial gunners were connecting with less than 4% of their shots against crossing targets. For every 100 rounds sent toward an enemy aircraft, moving perpendicular to the gunner, 96 struck nothing. The numbers told a grim story. A typical engagement lasted 8 to 12 seconds before the enemy fighter withdrew or moved beyond effective range. The Browning M2 could fire approximately 800 rounds per minute, roughly 13 per second. In a 10-second window, a gunner might send 130 rounds into the air. With a 4% hit rate, perhaps 5 bullets would actually strike the target, insufficient to bring down most enemy fighters, which could absorb dozens of 50 caliber rounds and remain airborne. The human toll was staggering. Throughout 1943, the 8th Air Force operating over Europe lost an average of 188 bombers monthly. Each B-17 carried 10 men, meaning nearly 1,900 aircrewmen were killed, captured, or went missing every 30 days. A significant portion of these losses came from bomber formations unable to defend themselves effectively against fighter attacks. The gunners are following their training precisely, tracking targets, maintaining proper sight pictures, controlling their fire bursts. The issue wasn't courage or commitment. It was physics, and physics was indifferent to bravery. Every gunner instinctively aimed directly at what they could see, which made perfect sense. Point at the target, pull the trigger, hit the target. This logic worked when shooting stationary targets, or even animals moving at modest speeds. But enemy fighters weren't moving at 20 miles per hour. They were crossing the gunner's field of view at speeds exceeding 300 miles per hour, with some late war models reaching 540. At these velocities, the time required for a bullet to travel from muzzle to target meant the target had already moved by the time the bullet arrived. The bullet itself traveled fast, roughly 2,900 feet per second, leaving a Browning M2. At short ranges against slow targets, this seemed instantaneous. But in aerial combat, short range meant 200 to 400 yards, and targets were moving at speeds that would have seemed impossible just 2 decades earlier. A Zero flying at 300 miles per hour covered 440 feet every second. For a 300-yard shot, 900 feet, the bullet needed roughly 0.31 seconds to cover the distance. In those 0.31 seconds, the Zero moved another 136 feet forward, roughly 11 car lengths. The gunner aimed at where the aircraft was, but the bullet arrived where the aircraft had been a third of a second earlier, passing through empty air while the enemy fighter continued unharmed. This phenomenon had a name: deflection error. Military scientists understood it, theoretically long before World War II, but understanding something in a classroom and solving it in combat were entirely different challenges. The deflection required wasn't a minor adjustment. It was massive and counterintuitive. Against a target crossing at 90 degrees at 300 yards, a gunner needed to aim approximately 15 to 20 feet ahead of the aircraft's nose. This meant placing crosshairs on what appeared to be completely empty sky, trusting the target would fly into the bullet stream. Every human instinct resisted this approach. Gunnery instructors attempted to teach deflection shooting during training, but results were poor. The Army Air Force's Flexible Gunnery School at Laredo, Texas, implemented rigorous programs starting in 1942. Trainees spent hours in turret simulators, shot at towed targets from moving trucks, studied diagrams showing proper lead angles. None of it translated effectively to actual combat. The problem was complexity. Deflection wasn't a single calculation. It changed constantly depending on target speed, angle, range, altitude, whether the target was climbing or diving, whether the bomber itself was turning. A B-17 ball turret gunner engaging a Bf-109 making a frontal attack needed different deflection than engaging the same aircraft during a beam attack from the side. And he had perhaps 4 seconds to process all these variables while being shot at while his aircraft bucked through flak damage, while his oxygen mask fogged at 5,000 feet. The psychological barrier proved just as deadly as the technical one. Gunners who survived their first missions and attempted deflection, shooting often abandoned it after apparent failures. They would aim ahead of a target, fire a burst, see their tracers arc through empty sky in front of the enemy plane, and conclude they had led too much. In the next engagement, they would reduce their lead, moving their aim point closer to the visible target. They were self-correcting in exactly the wrong direction, trusting their eyes over physics they couldn't see. Gun camera footage from 1943 missions shows this pattern repeatedly: initial bursts with some forward lead, followed by subsequent bursts walking backward until the gunner was shooting directly at, or even slightly behind the target's current position. The casualties mounted. 8th Air Force records from October 1943 missions to Schweinfurt showed 20% losses. 60 bombers failing to return out of 290, 1 dispatched. Survivors landed with dead and wounded crewmen, shredded hydraulic lines, engines trailing smoke. In debriefings, gunners reported the same frustration. They had been shooting, their guns had been working, but their bullets hadn't been connecting. Something fundamental had to change, and quickly, because at current loss rates the Allied bombing campaign would collapse before reaching Berlin. The solution had been sitting in a filing cabinet since 1924, written by a man most combat aircrews had never heard of. An American artillery officer named James Puckle, gifted in ballistics, had published a technical paper titled The Problem of Lead in Aerial Gunnery, while serving as an instructor at the Army's Field Artillery School. Puckle had served in France during World War I, witnessed the first attempts at air-to-air combat, and recognized that aviation speeds were about to create a targeting crisis traditional marksmanship couldn't solve. His paper laid out the mathematics with brutal clarity, demonstrating that as aircraft speeds increased beyond 150 miles per hour, required deflection angles would exceed human intuitive capability. He calculated that against a target moving at 250 miles per hour at a perpendicular angle, a gunner would need to aim approximate 4 to 5 aircraft lengths ahead of the visible target. His paper included exhaustive tables showing required lead for various combinations of target speed, range, and crossing angle. The numbers were staggering, and Puckle's conclusion was even more disturbing. Without mechanical assistance, aerial gunners would be effectively useless within a decade. The Army filed his paper and forgot about it. Throughout the 1920s and 30s, military aviation advanced rapidly, but gunnery training remained rooted in World War I methodology. Instructors taught marksmanship fundamentals as if students were preparing for rifle competitions rather than three-dimensional chases at 300 miles per hour. When the United States entered World War II in December 1941, Army Air Force's gunnery training was catastrophically unprepared for modern air combat reality. The standard training program lasted 4 weeks. Students fired roughly 1,000 rounds total during their entire qualification course. Most of that ammunition went toward stationary targets and slowly towed sleeves, moving at maybe 150 miles per hour in predictable straight lines. Not a single training scenario replicated the chaos of a fighter diving through a bomber formation at 400 miles per hour while executing a barrel roll. Graduates received their wings, climbed into bombers, flew to England or the Pacific, and discovered their training was worthless the first time an enemy fighter flashed across their gun sight. By mid-1942, desperate commanders started searching through old technical libraries for anything that might help. A captain named Robert Williams, assigned to the 8th Air Force Gunnery Analysis Section, found Puckle's 1924 paper in the archives. Williams read it in one sitting, then immediately drafted a memo to his commanding officer with 2 words underlined 3 times. He knew. Puckle had predicted this exact disaster 18 years before the first B-17 ever flew a combat mission over Europe. His calculations were still accurate. His warnings had been correct. And hundreds of American aircrewmen had died because nobody had listened. The question wasn't whether Puckle had been right. The mathematics were indisputable. The question was whether anything could actually be done about it. Training gunners to consciously calculate deflection angles while being shot at seemed impossible. The human brain couldn't process trigonometry at combat speed. But if conscious calculation wouldn't work, perhaps something else would. The British had already started finding answers, born from the same duration during summer 1940. RAF Squadron 609, Flying Spitfires, faced a gunnery crisis that mirrored what American bombers would encounter 2 years later. Their pilots were brave, their aircraft magnificent, but they were missing. Flight Lieutenant John Dundas reviewed gun camera footage from July engagements and discovered his squadron's hit rate against crossing Messerschmitt Bf-109s was hovering around 6%. The Spitfire carried enough ammunition for roughly 16 seconds of sustained fire. Pilots were burning through their entire combat load and watching German fighters fly home untouched. Squadron leader Horace Darley, commanding the squadron, made a radical decision. He grounded his entire unit for 3 days in early August 1940, right in the middle of the Battle of Britain, when every fighter was desperately needed, and conducted live fire experiments that violated every standard in the RAF training manual. Darley had been a competitive clay pigeon shooter before the war, and he understood something about leading moving targets that military theorists had overlooked. The best shotgun shooters didn't calculate. Lead, they felt it. Their brains processed the target's movement subconsciously. Their hands moved the barrel ahead of the clay disc without conscious mathematical thought. Darley wondered if fighter pilots could learn the same instinctive response. His experiment was brutally simple. He had a Hurricane fighter tow a target banner across the gunnery range while his Spitfire pilots made repeated firing passes. But instead of the standard approach, pilots aiming carefully, trying to calculate precise lead angles, Darley instructed them to do something that sounded insane: don't aim at all. Instead, watch the target's movement, let your eyes track its path, and start firing while your aircraft is still turning to follow. Let the deflection happen naturally through the motion of your turn, rather than trying to consciously create it with aiming adjustments. Fire into where your instincts say the target is going, not where your eyes say it currently is. The first attempts were disasters. Pilots missed the banner by 50 feet, their bullets stitching patterns across empty sky. But Darley made them repeat the exercise again and again. 40 passes each over 3 days. No lectures about ballistics, no trigonometry, no tables of deflection angles, just repetition with one simple instruction. Fire while you're still moving, not after you've steadied on target. By the 3rd day, something remarkable happened. The pilots' hit rates began climbing. They went from 6% to maybe 12%. Not dramatic, but that doubling meant twice as many bullets hitting German aircraft, which meant twice as many kills or twice as many damaged enemy fighters returning to base unable to fly the next mission. Darley documented his results and submitted them to Fighter Command Headquarters on August 18, 1940. His report included a crucial observation: the pilots who improved fastest weren't the ones with the best peacetime marksmanship scores. They were the ones who could suppress their instinct to aim carefully and instead trust their peripheral vision and motion sense. The conscious brain, Darley argued, was too slow for modern air combat. The answer was training the subconscious to handle deflection automatically, the same way a baseball player's brain calculates where a fly ball will land without consciously solving trajectory equations. Fighter Command circulated Darley's findings, but implementation was scattered and inconsistent. Some squadrons adopted the technique enthusiastically, others dismissed it as unscientific nonsense. The RAF's training command was particularly resistant. Their instructors had decades of experience teaching marksmanship fundamentals, and Darley's approach seemed to abandon everything they knew. But combat results didn't lie. Squadrons that embraced motion-based deflection shooting showed measurably better kill ratios through autumn 1940. The data was clear enough that by early 1941, the technique was quietly becoming standard practice, even if official training manuals hadn't caught up yet. American military observers in Britain took detailed notes on Darley's methods, but the United States Army Air Forces faced a different problem. Fighter pilots could potentially learn instinctive deflection through repetition, but bomber gunners couldn't. A Spitfire pilot controlled his entire aircraft, using motion and angles to create natural lead. A waist gunner in a B-17 stood in a fixed position while his aircraft flew straight and level through flak, unable to maneuver, unable to use aircraft movement to generate deflection. He had only his hands on the gun and his eyes on the target. If conscious calculation was too slow and instinctive motion wasn't available, the solution had to be mechanical. Enter the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, specifically the Radiation Laboratory's Division 7, established in early 1942. The name was deliberate misdirection. Radiation Laboratory suggested atomic research, which helped maintain secrecy around what Division 7 actually built fire control systems. The division head, Dr. Charles Stark Draper, was a 40-year-old engineer who had spent the previous decade developing gyroscopic instruments for aircraft navigation. Draper understood that the deflection problem wasn't fundamentally about shooting. It was about prediction. A gun sight needed to show the gunner not where the target currently was, but where the target would be when the bullets arrived. The Mark 14 computing gun sight emerged from Draper's laboratory in prototype form by July 1943. It looked like something from science fiction, a reflector sight connected to a gyroscope system weighing 28 pounds and requiring electrical power from the aircraft's generator. The gunner operated through a mechanical ranging control, turning a dial to match reference marks to the target's wingspan, which gave the sight the range information it needed. Then he tracked the target for approximately 2 seconds while keeping it centered in a small tracking circle. During those 2 seconds, the gyroscope measured the target's angular velocity, how fast it was moving across the gunner's field of view. Here's where it got remarkable. The Mark 14's internal mechanism used a series of cams and gears, analog computers built from machine metal, to solve the deflection equation in real time. It took the range input from the gunner, the angular velocity from the gyroscope, and the known ballistic properties of the .50 caliber round, then calculated exactly how far ahead of the target the guns needed to point. It displayed the result as a lighted reticle that appeared to float in space ahead of the target. The gunner didn't aim at the aircraft anymore. He aimed at the glowing dot. And if he had ranged correctly and tracked smoothly, the dot showed him exactly where to shoot. The Mark 14 solved mathematics that would take a human brain several minutes using pencil and paper. And it solved those equations 30 times per second, continuously updating as the target's angle and range changed. Testing at Naval Air Station Norfolk Virginia during August 1943 produced results that seemed almost impossible. Gunners who had never achieved better than 5% hit rates against crossing targets immediately jumped to 18% with the Mark 14, and that was on their first day using the system. After a week of practice, rates climbed above 25%. That was a 5-fold improvement over manual aiming, translating directly into 5 times more enemy aircraft damaged or destroyed per engagement. But manufacturing and installing tens of thousands of Mark 14 sights across the bomber fleet would take time the Allies didn't have. Production didn't begin in meaningful numbers until early 1944, and installation priority went to new aircraft rolling off assembly lines rather than retrofitting existing bombers. That meant the majority of gunners flying missions through late 1943 and early 1944 were still using basic iron sights or crude reflector sights with no computing ability. They needed something they could implement immediately, without waiting for new technology, without requiring electrical modifications to their aircraft. They needed a technique that worked with equipment they already had. The breakthrough came not from engineers or scientists, but from combat gunners themselves, specifically from the Pacific Theater where engagement distances and visibility were often better than over cloud-covered Europe. Staff Sergeant William Fleming, a waist gunner who by March 1944 had flown 31 combat missions and survived 4 aircraft losses, wasn't an officer and didn't have a college education. But he had fired approximately 40,000 rounds in combat and had personally witnessed hits on 7 enemy aircraft. He had also kept a notebook. Fleming's notebook contained something unusual, sketches of enemy aircraft with hand-drawn lines extending forward from their noses, showing where he had actually aimed during successful engagements. He had measured these lead distances by comparing them to the target aircraft's length, 2 plane lengths ahead or 3 plane lengths ahead. On March 14, 1944, Fleming presented his notebook to Lieutenant Commander Edward O'Hare during a routine debriefing session. O'Hare, already a Medal of Honor recipient and one of the Navy's top tacticians, immediately recognized what he was seeing: empirical deflection data gathered under actual combat conditions. O'Hare ordered Fleming to conduct training sessions with every gunner in the air group. Not classroom lectures, but practical exercises using a simple technique that became known as the spot shooting method. Fleming would have gunners stand at their positions, while another crew member walked along the flight deck, holding a model aircraft on a pole. As the model flew past at various angles, Fleming coached gunners to extend their aim forward by specific increments: 1 aircraft length for slight crossing angles, 2 lengths for moderate angles, 3 or more for steep crossing shots. The key was giving gunners a visual reference they could remember and apply instantly. Count plane lengths forward from the nose, then fire. The carrier Lexington's gunnery officer, skeptical but desperate for anything that might work, authorized controlled testing during operations off Truk Lagoon in late March 1944. He pulled ammunition expenditure and hit confirmation data for the previous 8 weeks, then tracked the same metrics after Fleming's training program. The results were undeniable. Prior to the training, the air group's gunners averaged 4.2 hits per 100 rounds fired against crossing targets. By the end of April, just 6 weeks after implementing spot shooting, that rate had climbed to 9.1 hits per 100. The technique had more than doubled their effectiveness. Word spread through the Pacific Fleet with remarkable speed. By May 1944, variations of Fleming's spot shooting method were being taught aboard multiple carriers. Each carrier's gunnery officers added their own refinements, but the core principle remained: give gunners a simple visual measurement system tied directly to the target's apparent size, eliminating the need for conscious calculation. A gunner didn't need to know he was compensating for 0.3 seconds of bullet flight time. He just needed to remember 3 plane lengths forward for a crossing shot. The technique worked because it matched how human visual processing actually functions. Our brains are exceptional at relative size comparison, but terrible at absolute distance estimation. Asking a gunner to lead by 50 feet meant nothing when he had no reference for what 50 feet looked like at 300 yards distance. But lead by 2 plane lengths gave him an immediate visual standard he could apply without thought. The zero he was tracking provided its own measuring stick. He just had to extend that measurement forward into empty space. The Army Air Forces adopted similar training protocols by mid-1944, though they called it radius of action shooting. Technical manuals started including illustrations showing proper lead distances expressed in multiples of target wingspan or fuselage length. The 8th Air Force Gunnery School at Lavenham, England rebuilt their entire training program around the technique during June 1944. Mission loss rates, while still significant, began declining. July 1944 showed 3.4% bomber losses per mission compared to 5.2% the previous October. That difference represented hundreds of crew members who flew home instead of dying over Germany. But knowing the technique and executing it under combat conditions remained 2 entirely different challenges. The human brain, even armed with the spot shooting method, still fought against itself when the shooting started. Psychologists embedded with the Army Air Forces documented this phenomenon extensively during 1944 interviews with returning gunners. The issue wasn't knowledge. Gunners could recite proper lead distances perfectly during debriefings. The issue was that conscious knowledge evaporated under stress, replaced by primal instinct that screamed, "Aim at the threat." Captain Harold Klein, an Army psychologist stationed at Bovingdon, studied this response through analysis of gun camera footage paired with post-mission interviews. He identified a pattern he termed threat fixation collapse. Gunners would start an engagement using proper deflection, but as the enemy fighter closed and perceived danger intensified, their aim point would progressively drift backward until they were shooting directly at, or even behind the target. Klein's data showed this collapse happened fastest during head-on attacks where closing speed between bomber and fighter exceeded 500 miles per hour, and the gunner had perhaps 2 seconds before the enemy opened fire. Under that extreme stress, rational technique dissolved into pure reaction point. At the scary thing, pull trigger. The only solution was repetition, so extensive that deflection shooting bypassed conscious thought entirely, embedding itself at the same neurological level as walking or catching a thrown ball. This required training time the military couldn't afford in 1943. But by late 1944, with Allied control of the air improving and training pipelines more established, gunnery schools extended their programs. The standard course that had been 4 weeks in 1942 expanded to 8 weeks, then 10. Students now fired 5,000 rounds during training instead of 1,000. And significantly, over half of those rounds went toward moving targets at realistic combat speeds. The Naval Air Gunner School at Jacksonville, Florida pioneered a particularly effective drill starting in August 1944. They mounted 50 caliber guns on motorized turrets that could spin and elevate rapidly, then had high speedboats tow targets across the water at speeds up to 60 miles per hour while varying their distance and crossing angles randomly. Gunner trainees engaged these targets repeatedly, 50 to 70 passes per day, until the act of leading became automatic. Instructors didn't correct students verbally during the drills. They simply had them shoot, check their hit pattern, adjust, and shoot again. The subconscious learned through feedback loops, faster than the conscious mind learned through instruction. Elite gunners who survived 30 or more missions demonstrated something remarkable in combat footage analysis. Their deflection aim points remained stable even under intense stress. When an enemy fighter came screaming through the formation, with cannon fire flashing from its wings, these experienced gunners maintained their lead automatically. Their conscious minds could be terrified. Many admitted to being absolutely convinced they were about to die during certain engagements. But their hands kept the proper sight picture anyway. They had achieved what martial artists call mushin, Or no, mind the state where technique happens without conscious direction. But that level of proficiency took time and ammunition most gunners never received. The mathematics of wartime training were brutal. If creating an expert deflection shooter required 5,000 practice rounds and 10 weeks of intensive training, but the bomber offensive needed 50,000 new gunners in 6 months, compromises were inevitable. The majority of gunners flying combat missions never achieved true unconscious competence. They remained perpetually in the conscious competence stage, capable of proper deflection shooting, when conditions allowed them time to think, but vulnerable to collapse under extreme stress or when facing unexpected tactical situations. This created a strange stratification in combat effectiveness. A bomber formation's defensive firepower wasn't uniform. It depended heavily on which specific gunners were in which specific positions on which specific aircraft. A formation that happened to include several veterans with deep training could fight off attacks that would devastate a formation of newer crews. German fighter pilots learned to identify and exploit this, targeting bombers that showed hesitant or inaccurate fire during initial passes, avoiding formations where defensive fire was immediate, heavy, and precisely placed. The deflection shooting revolution that began with British experiments and American desperation didn't end when World War II concluded in 1945. The core principle that you must aim where the target will be, not where it is, became foundational to every weapons system developed afterward. The Mark 14 computing gun sight evolved into the Mark 18, which served through the Korean War, then into digital fire control computers that could process dozens of variables simultaneously. By Vietnam, fighter aircraft carried radar-assisted gun systems that calculated deflection automatically, requiring pilots only to keep targets within acquisition parameters. Modern air-to-air combat has largely moved beyond guns entirely. Missiles handle interception at ranges where deflection would require leading by miles rather than feet. But the underlying physics hasn't changed, just the implementation. Modern missiles use inertial guidance and active radar to continuously update trajectory toward where the target will be, executing deflection calculations thousands of times per second. Advanced fighter radars don't just track targets. They predict future positions based on current velocity and acceleration, then position the aircraft and select weapons accordingly. It's the same problem William Fleming solved with hand-drawn sketches in 1944, now handled by computers instead of gunners counting plane lengths. Interestingly, deflection shooting fundamentals remain part of modern fighter pilot training. Despite guns being tertiary weapons in contemporary air combat, the Navy fighter weapons school still teaches basic fighter maneuvers that include guns-only engagements. Not because pilots expect to dogfight with cannons, but because learning to visually predict where a maneuvering target will be develops spatial awareness that applies to every aspect of air combat. A pilot who has mastered deflection shooting intuitively understands closure rates, angle, off, and lead pursuit curves, concepts that matter whether firing a cannon or positioning for a missile shot. The lessons extend beyond aviation into any domain involving fast-moving targets. Modern anti-aircraft systems, from the Phalanx C-2S defending naval vessels to the C-RAM protecting ground bases, are essentially sophisticated implementations of what those 1943 bomber gunners struggled to do manually. The Phalanx fires 500 rounds per minute, 75 rounds per second. At incoming missiles and aircraft, its radar continuously calculating deflection and updating aim point. It makes the same corrections Eddie Kowalski needed over the Solomon Islands, just faster and without the human hesitation that cost so many lives. The transformation from 4% hit rates in early 1943 to 20+% by late 1944 represents one of the most dramatic tactical improvements of World War II, achieved not through superior equipment or overwhelming numbers, but through understanding and working with human cognition rather than against it. Thousands of aircrewmen who would have died continued flying. Enemy fighters that would have escaped went down in flames. bombing campaigns that might have failed reached their targets. All because someone finally acknowledged that human instinct, however strong, could be wrong, and that survival meant training people to ignore what felt natural and trust what physics demanded. The gunners who learned to aim at empty sky, who forced themselves to fire at nothing visible and trust their bullets would meet metal, proved something essential about human adaptability under pressure. We are not prisoners of our instincts. With proper understanding, sufficient training, and enough necessity, we can rewire our responses to match reality, rather than demanding reality match our intuitions. That lesson, born in blood over Europe and the Pacific, remains relevant anywhere humans confront situations where instinct and solution point in opposite directions.